Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Lysett, the director of the program on the global environment, and it's my very distinct pleasure to welcome you to this celebration of the publication of the social life of forests, social lives of forests, past, present, and future of woodland resurgence. We're lucky enough tonight to be joined by 4 authors and 2 editors of the book. Myself, Frederick Albrecht-Janssen in the front row, Kathleen Morrison, and Susanna Hecht, who are 2 of the 3 editors of the volume. The volume comes from a conference held on this campus in 2008, a conference that was the inaugural conference of the program on the global environment. So really, we've seen our first big event come to fruition tonight. This conference brought together an extraordinary and distinguished group of scholars from a variety of disciplines to consider both the ecological and the social dimensions of forests in a broad context. The participants in the conference critically examined human histories as conjoined with natural ones, focusing on both contemporary and historical understandings about forest change, about its management and use, about deforestation and loss, about afforestation and forest resurgence in light of broad empirical research. In its attention to the complex and multiple and sometimes contested disciplinary perspectives on forests and forest history, the conference really opened a new kind of dialogue, a fruitful and better informed kind of discussion of the future of forests in the context of large-scale environmental change and social change. And we'll be hearing more about both the findings of the conference, right, and how these problems have been treated subsequently tonight. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank many of the sponsors who helped make the conference and the subsequent publication of the volume possible. The Donnelly Foundation, the Lickstern Fund of the Anthropology Department, the U.S. Department of Education, the Norman Waight Harris Memorial Foundation Fund, and the Center for International Studies, all of whom supported either the original conference or the subsequent publication. I'd also like to thank, and really thank, the various staff members of the program on the global environment and the Center for International Studies, as well as the editors and staff of the University of Chicago Press. I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers, our 2 editors who are here tonight. The first, Susanna Hecht. Susanna is professor in the Department of Urban Planning at the UCLA School of Public Affairs and Urban Planning. Professor Hecht is a graduate of the college and holds a PhD in geography from Berkeley. She's been a leader in the theoretical and methodological development of a mature political ecology, especially as it engages the analysis of complex human, environmental, and institutional dynamics surrounding globalization and development in the tropical Americas. Her research takes in a very broad range of topics, including the political economies of development and its comparative environmental and social impacts, the environmental and social history of the tropics, and notably the historical and political ecology of deforestation and afforestation in Latin America. She's the author or co-author of numerous articles and several influential books, including Fate of the Forest, Developers, Destroyers, and Defenders of the Amazon, Agroecology and Small Farm Development, Development or Destruction, the Conversion of Tropical Forests to Pasture, and Scramble for the Amazon. Right? Most recently, The Lost Paradise of Euclides de Cunha from the U of C Press. Right? Get them all. Susanna will be speaking second. First, we'll hear from our own Professor Kathleen Morrison. Kathy is the Newcomb Family Professor of Anthropology and of Social Sciences in the college. She has a bachelor's from Notre Dame, a master's from the University of New Mexico, and a PhD, all in anthropology, from the University of California at Berkeley. She is a leading scholar of pre-colonial South Asia, whose work focuses on a number of related issues, including the formation and transformation of anthropogenic landscapes, the causes and consequences of agricultural change, and the interplay between political power, economic organization, and social strategies of production and exchange. Her research is notable both for its theoretical and its technical breadth, taking in methods and perspectives from archaeology, history, geography, palynology, and vegetation history, and most recently, stable isotope ecology. She's author of a truly frightening number of articles and book chapters, an editor or author of several important books, including Doroji Valley, Landscape History and Place in the Making of a Dryland Reservoir System, Vizianagara Metropolitan Survey, Forager Traders in South and Southeast Asia, Long-Term Histories, Empires, Perspectives from Archaeology and History, and Fields of Victory, Vizianagara and the Course of Intensification. Please join me in welcoming Susanna and Kathleen tonight.
We have to get my PowerPoint up. I will go first because Susanna is a very hard, if not impossible, act to follow.
You should be able to just minimize that.
Oh, well, okay, we're good. Thank you all for coming here today. I don't want to talk too long because we're here to celebrate, really. We're here to celebrate, of course, the launch of the book, Social Lives of Forests, celebrate its authors, and think a little bit about what we've learned from it, and then, of course, sell books. But I also want to point out it's a parallel celebration, really, of the program on the global environment, which, as Mark said, was born the same year as the conference. In 2008, the conference that was the kernel of this book. So really, I think today is a celebration of the staff, the faculty, and very especially the students who've made PGE such really a rousing success over the last number of years. So I don't want to reiterate everything Mark said, but I would like to thank PGE and CIS, the director and the staff for all their support, and particularly to our two editorial assistants who unfortunately couldn't be here, Melissa Figueroa and Christine Malcolm, who really helped us wrestle this deep, this complex volume with 28 chapters and more than more than 50 authors, wrestled it to the ground. Mahesh Rangarajan called the conference itself a hothouse, and indeed it really was, as Mark said. It really crossed disciplinary boundaries with social scientists, humanists, biological and physical scientists, and it was a major effort, I think, to have productive and congenial conversations and try and develop some shared frameworks, and maybe that's why it took so long for the book to come out. So thanks to everyone, and finally, not least, thanks to the press, including to our marvelous editor, Christy Henry, and all of the staff who worked on the volume. We really appreciate it. So I hope you don't mind that I'm just going to give a kind of very personal account of the book for me, and Susanna will tell you what you really need to know afterwards. And the book, has been with me for a long time now, so it's hard for me to think about it any other way. In the acknowledgement, if you read the acknowledgement, which is always the most interesting part of most books, you'll notice that I begin the story of how Susanna and I had a number of discussions sitting under the twisty oak trees of the Center for Advanced Study of Behavioral Science at Stanford. And Susanna insisted quite vehemently on the importance of the forest transition and the need to rethink its contours, especially in the tropics. And she was very eloquent on the topic of woodland resurgence, as you'll find out in a few minutes. And it was so impressive, honestly. It seemed as though these oaks might overrun Stanford at any moment, right? But if we think about this, we think, what is, in fact, a forest? And actually, of course, it's quite difficult to say. And it's certainly true that the not very well agreed upon biological definitions really fail to capture much of the affective, the culturally and historically variable aspects of the concept. Mahesh Rangarajan, who's a paper in the volume, reminds us that in India, forest is first and foremost a legal definition. And here in India, the state powerfully mediates access to forest lands and use of forest lands, whether those lands have trees on them or not. It has nothing to do with vegetation. So in India, what are forests are lands owned by the Forest Department. Very simple, period. And until the development of official forms of remote sensing in India in the 1970s, because they don't believe anyone else's figures, this was precisely how areas under forests were estimated by the existence of Forest Department land. But recently, in 1996, the Indian Supreme Court in the Godavarman case held, in fact, that forest was not only a legal category, but it was also a natural one. This is a new development, so that any area which has a lot of trees is necessarily now also a forest. What that means is that anyone who lives within those areas, including those who depend on those forests for livelihood, are newly disenfranchised and termed as encroachers. So this ambiguity of definition of what forests are can be quite useful, as we'll see, for those in power. Now, it's very difficult, of course, to measure something that we can't quite define. And I have hardly any charts and graphs, so don't worry about this too much. In the book, Alan Granger makes an effort, though, and provides us with some very careful definitions of forests and some practical thinking about the difficulty of actually measuring forest cover. And Alan points out really the rather staggering fact that until recently, forestation, that is positive forest change, however achieved, was not really something that people even thought to measure. And he carefully outlines how the procedures of forest assessments, like the United Nations FAO series of forest resource assessments, which you see the graphs here, are actually structured. These assessments are actually structured to assume, for example, that national forest area has declined since the previous survey. That's an assumption that's built into the methodology of the analysis. So perhaps it's not too surprising that using these techniques, you get these kind of frightening looking downward facing lines. Okay. But I leave it to you to read his chapter and critique his methods for yourself. But even using these very same data, he shows in chapter 7 that pretty convincingly, I think, that worldwide tropical moist forest area has actually changed very little since about 1980. So there's been very minor change. So that doesn't mean that there's been no deforestation, but it does mean that forestation has also taken place and that that's not something that's really been carefully documented. These results, of course, were anticipated by a well-known study by Hecht and Acai in 2007, which was a careful wall-to-wall comparison of satellite images taken in 1989 and 2002 of the entire country of El Salvador, showing significant forest expansion. I think Susanna is going to show us some satellite data today. So given the kind of obsession of seeing forests as places apart, that is, places apart from humans, something that Mark Lyson and I discuss in our paper in the context of South Asia, but a pattern that certainly has very broad resonance in the West as well, we have, as I think, as Susanna has been arguing, failing to see the forests in our midst, and including the urban forests that we now inhabit. In the volume, Peter Crane and his colleagues close the volume with an excellent paper on forests close to home, with their discussion of Chicago wilderness, which is both a concept, you might say, and an organization of great relevance to all of us here in Chicago. At the conference and in the book, we had and have several provocative discussions, including one by ecologist Robin Chasden and her colleagues about successional pathways and the effects of human activities on them. Chasden and colleagues conclude, in fact, that the distinction between natural regeneration and feral forests, I'll explain that in a minute, is, as they say, fuzzy at best, and that human land use legacies play a critical role in shaping contemporary forests. So for a future direction, I think something that we didn't get to in the book as much as I would have liked was to consider how really basic ecological principles may need rethinking once human beings are admitted, in a sense, back into the garden, right? So what Lentz and Lane refer to as legacy forests or feral forests are really modern contemporary forests that have certain kinds of histories. We might argue, in fact, that all forests are like this. Lentz and Lane are botanists, and they carried out a vegetation survey in 2 areas in Belize, one near the abandoned Mayan city of Dos Hombres, and one in an area without major Mayan occupational history, obviously a difference that's made possible by the work of a lot of archaeologists. So more than 1,000 years after the abandonment of Dos Hombres, they found that the feral forests there contained a greater proportion of tree species that were of economic importance to the ancient Maya, still there in the forest, as well as slightly lower levels of biodiversity, really long-term legacies of this shared socio-natural histories. So many forests, as we see in the book and in other research, even ones originally sometimes seen as pristine, are actually then legacies. Now, Latin America and the Amazon in particular made the cover of the book, very pretty picture, but not only because it's in some sense iconic of the ideal of tropical forest for many people. Here, I gave you some very iconic looking pictures, but also that, and related to that, I think, because here it's one of the most dramatic stories of forest history that's being retold here in the Amazon. Susanna will probably say more about this. So once seen as the largest pristine tropical forest in the world, as an outpost of nature, archaeological and paleoecological evidence has shown us quite convincingly that this region played host to an unexpectedly large and complex human population prior to colonization, as both Michael Heckenberger and his colleagues and also Clark Erickson show in their contributions to the volume. So here are a couple of Clark's photos from his chapter in the volume. You can see on the left a huge ring-shaped ditch, 108 meters in diameter, 2 meters deep, in a part of the Bolivian Amazon where he's been doing archaeological field work for a long time. And on the right, obviously an area recently cleared of vegetation, or it wouldn't be possible to see it. Very extensive network of pre-Columbian raised fields, canals, and causeways, all underneath this so-called presumably pristine tropical forest. So far from being a counterfeit paradise with thin, nutrient-deficient soils that are unfriendly to agriculture, what I learned as an undergraduate, parts of Amazonia actually have very organic and nutrient-rich soils. These are the famous dark earths, or Amazonian dark earths, that at the conference, James Fairhead and Melissa Leach noticed may also be present in tropical Africa. Here's a little diagram showing the difference. These soils are in fact artifacts. They're artifacts of human occupation. They're full of the debris of past occupants and the result of large-scale composting and active intervention by previous residents. So these islands of fertility and very rich soil, I'm not sure if you can read that, but in the little red circle, it says potsherds, lithic artifacts, anthropogenic, right? So the Amazonian dark earths are in fact themselves artifacts. So while earlier scholars, people like Betty Meggers, had claimed that these areas of dark soil were actually natural creations left by winding riverbeds, again, I learned this as an undergraduate in cultural ecology class. In fact, these fertile soils were made in the course of human intervention in local environments, interventions that left a legacy of lush tropical forest stands. So the expansive forests of the Amazon, these resurgent forests, secondary forests, you might say, of course stand on top of another human legacy, and one which is not such a happy one, and one less salubrious, because the re-expansion of forests in this area obviously owes a great deal to colonial era depopulation, right? Both the unintentional expansion of virgin soil epidemics following European colonial contact, and also the active exploitation of indigenous peoples, right? So genocide and woodland resurgence, we see in the volume an emphasis on the importance of war and violence in forest history, as described, for example, in papers by Peluso and Vandergeest in the volume, and in a few other cases, also in Joe Masco's paper, for example. So in the Amazon, as elsewhere, we see what Susanna refers to in some of her articles as a kind of cultural amnesia, right? An historical ecological forgetting an imaginary as well as an historical rewilding of the Amazon that allowed a previously densely settled human landscape to come to be seen as nature's last refuge. And this point is also powerfully made in Susanna's new book, The Scramble for the Amazon, also by the University of Chicago Press, as long as we're, blatantly shilling books here. And so it's definitely a change to think of the Amazon as a secondary forest. But I also want to point out, perhaps, selfishly, as someone who works on the archaeology and paleoecology and historical side of things, the important role played by disciplinary convergence in all of this. Here we have archaeology, paleoecology, botany, geography, history, and biology all playing a role in upsetting some of our most cherished stories about nature and about change. It turns out there was not a simple story of forest loss or a simple correlation between humans and degradation. So what this implies then is that we cannot really be content with accounts of environmental history that posit qualitative and essential breaks from aboriginal harmony, or you can have primitive degradation, it doesn't matter. Take your pick. So a break between these earlier conditions, harmony or degradation, with colonialism, capitalism, modernity, again, take your pick, right? It's not at all convincing to me. So this is, of course, very highly relevant to, for example, the literature, the recent literature and interest in the notion of an Anthropocene, right? A new geological period in which humans uniquely become agents of global change, right? And to me, it seems interesting that the Anthropocene literature is actually shockingly ignorant, really, of human-environment interactions before about the last 300 years. So let's go back to the oak trees of Stanford for a moment. Susanna is very optimistic, as you'll see, and she sees forests everywhere. I had a little skepticism, maybe because I don't work in Latin America. I work in South Asia. And I know, I'm quite familiar with the literature she's describing, but and contributed to some of it myself, but it seemed unlikely to me that in South Asia we actually saw any woodland resurgence whatsoever. Here, for example, we know that the story was one of progressive and continuous forest loss throughout the Holocene, a trend which, as all environmental historians of South Asia will tell you, accelerated with the expansion of European colonial forestry, railroad construction, and other activities, especially in the 19th century, and has been on track ever since, okay? So this is the story, but is it really the story? And honestly, I'll tell you, it was Susanna's vehemence that prompted me really to re-examine my own data. I've been working along with my colleagues on agrarian and political transformations in southern India and this beautiful landscape here over a period of about the last 600 years. And I focused especially on about a 200-year period of agrarian expansion, much of this associated with the loss of woody cover, with soil erosion, with reservoir siltation, and just really generally a range of rather negative environmental consequences that my colleagues and I had documented very carefully using a lot of different kinds of methods. So we have plenty of empirical information. We have textual data, we have archaeology, we have paleoenvironmental data, including pollen evidence for past vegetation. So it's entirely possible with our data set to look for woodland resurgence. And looking at our material, re-looking at my material again, actually, yes, there was some woodland resurgence, and in a context that actually makes sense. It was in a period of urban abandonment. So forest loss in this region, it turns out, was actually much more significant in the early 16th century than at any time up until actually yesterday, probably, because even the late 20th century had more forest cover in northern Karnataka than the early 16th century. That's changed actually quite dramatically with large-scale mining just in the last 20 years or so. So what we see then is the story of the uniformity of a consistent colonial 19th century forest loss also seemed highly suspect. Not only was there some small-scale woodland resurgence, but also we saw a period in which the so-called colonial ecological watershed did not, in fact, seem to hold true, that there were already massive environmental impacts prior to colonization. So my colleagues and I were already working, with the idea, now quite common, I think, but it wasn't then, with the idea of socio-natures, which is a kind of ugly neologism, I would say, that works to try and transcend a nature-culture divide in the reconstruction and understanding of historical trajectories. So what happens, we ask, when non-human agents are taken seriously as actors in contingent histories that also include humans? And when I say taken seriously, what I don't mean is that we just talked about them, but that we actually did the hard work of studying them. That is, instead of only looking at texts or oral histories or temples, we also have evidence for those things: pollen grains, chemical and isotopic signatures, ostracods, vitalists, soils, and a lot of other kinds of proxy measures of past landscapes, right? But unlike our colleagues in the natural sciences, whose work is absolutely vital and critical in such an enterprise, I think we also have to imagine human agency as being part of natural processes such as succession, speciation, and even forestation, right? So putting both of these sides, you might say, the science and the non-science, nature and culture, humans and non-humans, together is what we've referred to as doing landscape history, that is attending to the kind of contingent socio-natural histories of specific kinds of places. So the forest transition literature, and Susanna will tell you what's all wrong and missing about it, did, however, prompt me to think about the ways in which I and others in South Asia and elsewhere had been thinking about historical transformations, that they're very much in line with what Fairhead and Leach have called degradation discourses, right? A specifically colonial discourse that has been ported wholesale into developmentalist and environmentalist thinking. And this is a sense of humans, or maybe some kinds of humans especially, as innately destructive of nature, such that the continued existence of humans on Earth demands these kind of declensionist histories, right? Stories of loss, stories of decline, stories of decay. These are the stories that dominate the news, for example. And these stories also undergird those which are told by advocates of ecological romanticism, that is, the reaction to these colonial degradation discourses, which argue that contrary to the idea of wasteful, irrational natives destroying natural wealth, instead we get a story in which we have traditional pre-colonial peoples who lived in Eden-like harmony with nature, at least until being disrupted by some sort of outside force like colonialism, capitalism, and modernity. So one strand of my previous work in this semi-arid region in southern India, I said I had focused on agricultural and landscape transformation of a very complex, urban, highly modified world, a world in which forests had been virtually extinguished from the land, or so it had seemed. Our own data, however, forced me to modify that view, and Susanna really, not only to recognize the episodes of woodland resurgence, it was modest, I have to say, it's not the Amazon, but also really to dare me to more explicitly challenge the intellectual traditions which had always seen the agrarian world of South Asia as being the domain of culture, and the forested uplands of South Asia as really being the domains of nature. And in fact, I'd already started working in that domain of nature in southern India, India's answer to the Amazon, I call it, the densely forested Western Ghat Mountains, a global biodiversity hotspot. Here you can see the Conservation International map showing the Western Ghats and Sri Lanka biodiversity hotspot. The Ghat Mountains, the Ghats contain a mixture of forest types, including humid tropical forests that are very rich in what are referred to as non-timber forest products. That is a whole array of goods such as spices, gums, resins, aromatics, and especially things like black pepper, cardamom, ginger, and other products which were critical for global economic exchange for about the past 2,000 years. So they're in no way isolated, remote, and separate from the sort of gritty world of commerce. And like parts of island Southeast Asia that Monika Janowski and her colleagues describe in the volume, these tropical forest landscapes are actually deeply imbricated in human histories. And the work of what Janowski et al. Call culturing the forest has a long history both there and here. So both the Pinan of Borneo that Janowski describes and the so-called tribal peoples of southern India discussed in our chapter have long been regarded as human equivalents of pristine forests, that untouched, ancient or remnant people living an archaic lifestyle. Okay, so we had worked on the human side. So this discourse of the remnant, right? Remnant forests, remnant peoples, is an example of what the anthropologist Johannes Fabian famously referred to as the denial of coevalness, which is sort of a funny way to put it. Or you might say a profound temporal distancing between different types of people who are actually contemporaries, right? The argument that some people are more ancient than others, even if we're standing in the same room, okay? So this critique has certainly taken root in anthropology, but not so much in development studies or in government discourse, right? So my own earlier work here, we're all about plugging our books, had made some progress towards addressing this discourse of the remnant in human terms, that is pointing to the dynamic history of Got foragers and forager traders, some of whom actually adopted hunting and gathering as a market-based specialization within the last 300 years, and none of whom can really legitimately be seen as living remnants of the Paleolithic. That is, not any more than any of us could be seen as living remnants. We're all living remnants of the Paleolithic, obviously, equally, right? So, so if the contemporary humans, they're still there, right? They're not gone. I put them in black and white before, but they're actually in living color. So if the contemporary humans who use the Got forest are not archaic remnants, but as it turns out, and here's the new part, neither really are the forests themselves, right? So we're still waiting for our Lenson lane to come to the Ghats and to study the existing vegetation structure in this light. So let me know if you want to come up afterwards and help out. But we do have some provocative paleo-environmental records. And in our article, Mark Lyson and I highlight one part of the very high elevation part of the Southern Ghats, an area called the Nilgiri Hills, which has actually a temperate vegetation. And here there's a patchy mosaic, it's a very pretty area, of forest, known as shola forest, and a savanna or grassland. People argue about which it is, so let's just call it savanna grassland. So these forest patches, though, are generally conceived in development by discourse by British colonial officers and by contemporary ecologists as being fragments, a term which really only makes sense in light of a kind of historical understanding of a prior connection, right? And also as remnants, right? A language used both by ecologists and by development agencies, which cast these remnants in terms of threat, damage, and loss, primarily threats by indigenous peoples, right? The paleoenvironmental data, which I won't bother you with here, though, suggest, however, I think quite powerfully, that many, if not most of these shola forests are actually relatively recent developments, only just a few hundred years old. And so that the direction of change has actually been more in the direction of woodland expansion, even to the event now that some contemporary human rights activists are worrying about forest expansion as a threat to the human rights of Toda pastoralists, people who rely on these grasslands for their basic subsistence, right? So on the one hand, we can have, the forest being a threat to Toda pastoralists, and on the other hand, we can say that the Toda pastoralists are the threat to and other indigenous people are the threat to these fragile remnant forest fragments, but it turns out they're actually relatively new. So these kind of fundamental misunderstandings of historical relationships are also discussed in the book in chapters by James Fairhead and Melissa Leach in terms of what they call false forest histories, by Rod Newman, by Clark Erickson, and in a very important discussion of how deforestation anxieties in Scotland shed light on the origin of modern economics by our very own Fredrik Alberton Jonsson. So all of these papers, I think, really point to the power of entrenched narratives about forests and about forest peoples, from degradation discourses to ecological romanticism. Say, accounts which I think, as we see, they're not only inaccurate, which bugs me, but also they're dangerous, right? They're dangerous in the sense that fortress conservation models, that is parks, reserves, I think we have a fortress, here we go. Parks, reserves, and other kinds of set-asides that set walls around nature, or what's presumed to be nature, first of all, they harm human livelihoods. That's not too controversial. But they're also dangerous because the very conservation goals, which are built, for example, on an axiom of letting nature take its course, where humans have no part in the conception of that nature, risk failure if it turns out that some forms of human action are actually needed to achieve those goals. This is something that we know very well in the Midwest, for example, where prairie restoration initiatives require a lot of active management, including consistent burning and other kinds of interventions. So let me just end then finally with Rod Newman's terrific paper in the volume, which is right on point here. Rod, whose previous work was based primarily in Africa, including an excellent book he wrote on the impact of fortress conservation models and the establishment of national parks in Africa. In our volume, he turns to an analysis of European Union biodiversity policies, EU biodiversity policies. And in really what he exposes as a stunning double standard, stunning, I think. He shows that in Europe, it's land abandonment that seemed to pose a threat to biodiversity. That is, the loss of traditional land use practices like grazing animals and, you know, quaint shepherds on the hills of Greece and so on. So it's human abandonment that leads to a threat to biodiversity. But in Africa, and I would say in Asia, and actually let's say in the whole formerly colonized world, it's actually land occupation which is seen to pose a threat, both to nature, to forests, and to biodiversity. So these kind of declensionist environmental histories then are clearly not for everyone. They're only for certain people, not for Europeans. And I think that there are some very significant contemporary implications then for these historical misrecognitions. So as Rod notes, and there's a reason we have Maasai pastoralists in my final slide here, he said, if any question remains about the extreme regional contrasts in conservation policy, imagine that Maasai pastoralists, rather than being rounded up by police and military forces and having their communities raised, which is true, were subsidized to continue their traditional grazing and burning practices in the East African savanna, which is indeed exactly what's happening in Mediterranean Europe. So a few thoughts then on, say, past and present of the social lives of forests, and I'll let, oh, here we are, some jolly scenes from the conference. And then I'll let Susanna, shall I launch yours, Susanna? Sideshow. Take it up.
Okay.
Go,
well,
Susanna.
It's such a hard act to follow. I don't know how to quiver and speak softly. So,
I've never heard that. You've never quivered or speak.
well, yes, I have. A few times. Well, we're going to sort of shift now into the new world, and what I'm going to sort of outline here are some of the more contemporary dynamics of what we're seeing. And I thought I would start off with a suitably foresty picture. And if you are an acai person and really worried about your health and antioxidants, of course, you will love this, because this so-called wild picture, of course, is of an acai forest, which has obviously been in production for a long time, but also is an activity that's expanding and taking over former pasture areas and areas of manioc agriculture. And many other areas because of global demand for this delicious international commodity, and also for national demand as well. So one of the things is that you have a lot of people going through forests like this and seeing them as essentially wild. And I actually have like boxes and boxes of photographs of wild landscapes that I now look at, and I just cringe to myself, didn't you have any idea? But the answer was at that time, no. So one of the things that Kathy talks about, and a lot of people in our book talk about, are the problems of the habits of thought. And one of them is essentially that I call this the Bambi syndrome, which is that everyone sees Bambi before they're 5. All those people were working with, Jungian archetypes, and so they stuck. And what happens then is that you have the Bambi syndrome, which is humans enter the forest and, they bring death, they bring fire, run, Bambi, run. They disrupt the natural harmony. And this is actually, I always teach that as the sort of initial environmental propaganda, mass environmental propaganda movie, followed by many others much later. But this kind of image is something that you see all the time about the tropics, and particularly about Amazonia, which is that you take a perfectly lovely place and turn it into a bunch of ashes, and then, tragedy ensues, and then it looks like this. And though no forest ever came back, it all just jams up, and it's going to be a catastrophe for the climate. We're going to have a major extinction caused by us. And it's also moving the tropics to a tipping point where what will happen is the climate will change and the humid tropical forest will go away. People are backing off from that a little bit, but that story, of course, keeps going on and is constantly repeated. And again, it's not as if there isn't any deforestation in Latin America, but where it's mostly occurring, and occurring less and less, because right now you have a kind of intensification frontier here, sort of decoupling of agricultural intensification from deforestation. But what you're seeing here is actually the soybean universe. And these blue things represent forest recovery. So you could see that these are areas where you wouldn't really expect them to be, such as Central America, northern Mexico, the northeast of Brazil. Actually, they could just put all of the Caribbean under these blue things because this is now described as a post-agricultural forest landscapes now. So the question then, as we start to look at this, is what's going on here? And one of the things that forest resurgence helps us understand is the sort of human nature that goes into shaping forests. Well, I started my general research in Amazonia concerned about questions of deforestation, totally committed to, Malthusian narratives and, improper technologies and so on and so forth. If you had asked me at any juncture, would deforestation rates ever decline? And would they ever decline under increased integration into global and national markets with higher levels of population? I would have never taken the bet. But what you have to realize is from about 2004 to now, essentially what we're seeing is a massive decline in the rate of deforestation. And there are a lot of explanations for this, which I'm going to go into in a minute, but it really has taken deforestation rates below those of described historically in the 1970s when they first started doing Landsat. So something is really going on in terms of these transformations. And it's not just within Brazil. These are things from greater Amazonia, and you can see I steal everything off of the Manga Bay website, but they do such a nice job. So if you needed to do a presentation on the tropics, go to Manga Bay because they have all the stuff that's great. But in any case, what you can see here is a generalized decline in the rate of deforestation in greater Amazonia. So this doesn't really fit. I mean, there's been lots of people coming in, there's roads being built, pipelines. What's the deal? So we go back to this question again. How does one begin to explain this? And I think that I'm going to go through another set of slides on, let me just take you to where this is. This is in the recovering area of what's called the Mata Atlantica, the Atlantic rainforest. I was just there in January. And this is an area that is considered one of the hottest of the hot spots. It's got 8,000 species, the high species diversity, under phenomenal threat because more than 120 million people live in this area. It's got 80% of the GDP of Brazil is produced there. It's wildly occupied and has been occupied for 10,000 years. It's considered to be a fragmented and tragic story of forest decline. Well, if you read the stuff up to where the data analysis goes to about 2005, it's all a story of catastrophe. But I'm going to show you some slides that show something different, and to also suggest that there's a kind of emerging discourse which is going, oh dear, perhaps we got this wrong. So this is a place called the Serra de Itajaí, and it's actually in part of the headwaters of an industrial corridor that you'll be glad to know produces something like 26% of the global chicken in the world, or chicken in global markets, and is number 2 in producing global tobacco. So it's an area, and then the region itself is a small industrial area, which includes things like also information sciences and so on. So anyway, it's a complicated economy. And you can't really understand it. It's been occupied for 140 years. So it's not really a pristine area by anybody's measure. So here we are, and what happens is this green area was a national park that was declared in 2004, and the area in red around it is a buffer zone. Now, so here we are in 1979, a kind of tragic vista. Deforestation and creeping up the mountain, it's going to be really bad. And then, oh, it's 2000. Somehow that creeping up the mountain hasn't really occurred. We're beginning to see a lot more forest stuff coming in. And then by this period, although this is a somewhat darker, the image itself is somewhat darker, what you see is a gradual regreening. That is that you have not only densification of the woodland, but also more woodlands in general. So one of the things, and this is an area, remember this is an area that has a big economy that is in place around it. Another place, another series that I'm going to show you is where nature has been extinguished. Of course, this is John Terberg's version of El Salvador. And it really was almost entirely deforested, except about 4% of the landscape, which was over here, which is now a national park, although it had been a cacao farm. And this has all been inhabited by the Olmecs. There's a long ecological history, and the whole region was a major Mayan settlement area. But anyway, be that as it may, so it went from this period of being almost completely deforested in the late 90s, and then by the mid 2000s, we had this extraordinary forest recovery, and now it's about 60% reforested. So what you see in these dynamics, and this is very densely populated. This has, it's not some kind of, that everyone moved to the cities. The rural areas have population densities of about 300 people per kilometer. So the question then has to be, what's going on? Here we have three big places that have had historically the worst narratives about ecological collapse and forest loss, and the forest trend is downward into oblivion, and it just doesn't happen. Well, first of all, there's a couple of things that you have to keep in mind. First, that the past doesn't predict the future, and the Malthusian models really aren't holding because all these areas are having much, much more population than they had before. The other thing is that there's significant decline in tropical deforestation in all of these biomes. You're not seeing deforestation anymore. And then you are also seeing, as I've shown in all of these, dynamics of forest recovery as well. So one of the question is, what's producing this? And one of the things that people talk about, and I talk about in this book, but also other people mention it as well, is this issue of forest transitions, which is that we're in the midst of a major structural change right now in terms of regional and national and global economies. And the way that that's manifested in a way that we can see is through these forest dynamics. So one is the problem of, but you wouldn't know that if you're getting, stuff from WWF and Conservation International, because they have an imaginary of the empty and the wild, and also a separation of the world into wild, agricultural, and urban. And so these are sort of conceptually and imagined to be spatially separated when they weren't. The other thing is that for forests, history is a biological and evolutionary one. And so there's a lack of attention to the sociality that has actually produced forests in the past and actually is producing them now. And there are several different types. And of course, Kathy's gone over that in a lot of detail. And that is, of course, the central theme of our book, which is that these are places that have deep sociality to them. You can't understand most forests in the world without understanding human history with them. The other thing is that anthropogenic landscapes have had their own little problems, which is that essentially the modern view of forests has been one of dehumanizing wild places, or most forests, and so those are dehumanized, while the built environment and humanly modified anthropogenic landscapes have been denatured. So one place has nature and one place has culture, and never the twain shall meet. And of course, this is Kathy's point as well. So the other thing is that there are complexities in space and complexities in time that produce these different kinds of forests. And once you go back and start to look at them, you find that your sense of the sort of forest primeval kind of evaporates. I have always a really great time fighting with my colleagues who work on the Upper Purus, which is where the place where my book on Scramble takes place, because they imagine that, and it is now a giant national park, seen to be sort of where the tribes who run from man relict the last Stone Age societies in primeval nature. And I always keep throwing this map up that shows, well, no, actually it wasn't, and there, you know, this was the heart. There were like wars going on here, and this was the heart of the rubber boom. But you know, and you can prove this by writing, you know. But they are not really interested in documents because the nature itself speaks to them in a way that it can't be. It doesn't speak to me. It speaks to me in a different way. The other thing is, of course, the extraction of forest products and their integration into larger economics is generally not well understood. And so you have a few things that imagine them as being sort of trotting out into this forest and picking things from nature's grand generosity, rather than these were highly manipulated and complex landscapes. And also that a lot of the stuff that's used, a lot of the stuff that flows in and out of forests is in fact invisible to most observers, because they're usually going and measuring something else and not necessarily that interested in the things that are flowing out. Again, as pointed out before, this sort of sounds like a screed against conservation agencies, but the other thing is that many things are excluded, which are actually quite dynamic forest landscapes in the tropics, which are peri-urban environments, urban environments. Our student, because she was here with Melisa, is now going to be working on urban economic forests in the Beleng. The other thing is that there's lots of inhabited landscapes that are sort of mosaics and matrices of complex ecological systems, many of which are forested or forested for a time. The other thing is essentially the problems of scale. That is, if you, either of time or of space. So I tend to go up and look at things from space as a way of trying to see what's going on these landscapes. But the other thing is that people who are doing a lot of this work don't understand that almost 1.5 billion people on the planet are forest dependent to one degree or another. That is, part of their livelihood or part of their subsistence comes from this. I'm not going to go over this too much. I can go over an exciting discussion of structural adjustment and globalization and so on. But I think what's important to highlight are a couple of things. First of all, in Latin America, it has only really quite recently, within the last 15 years, come out of being under authoritarian regimes for most of the 20th century. So in essence, one of the things that we see happening is sort of an efflorescence of new kinds of institutions, new kinds of regulations, the capacity to monitor things, and also the rise of civil society making claims on these landscapes in ways that were not there before. So one of the things that's important, and we have a section on the book really, which is about the questions of social movements, rights, and institutions in shaping how forests come into play. And these also are really contested. So we have Pelusa's work, we have many, many other people who, Deborah Berry, and I should have the book in front of me so I can look at the names. But one of the things that's very important in all of this is that claiming forests has been one mechanism through which forests have been able to remain standing. The other thing that is also important are what are called social transfers. So it's not just knowledge, but also things like in the modern welfare state in Latin America, what are called conditional cash transfers, so that you send your kids to school, the role of international remittances, and in a certain sense, you can think of RED funding or carbon offset funding as being a kind of social transfer that goes to people. And what it means is that instead of having to grow food, they can buy it. So this has another set of implications for things like food sovereignty and so on. But in essence, what it means is that you have a lot more cash into these systems, and what happens is they might buy food, but they will be investing in forest activities, many of which are much more highly remunerated than food systems at this juncture. So this is Chico Mendes, sort of the martyr for social movements in Amazonia, and actually for all Latin America. He has a tremendous picture. But one of the things that also, that it's not just a question of static institutions and rights, and it's also not just a question of monocausality, but that in essence what you have is a number of transformations in terms of legal systems that have changed the capacity for local governance. So the inhabited conservation as a socio-environmental concept is now very widespread in Latin America. That is to say, a conservation area can have people in it. In fact, its authenticity is important. Its use by traditional peoples, whether these are indigenous populations, runaway former slave communities, former rubber tapper areas, and so on. This becomes as widely spread throughout Latin America, and what it means is that rather than to claim land by clearing it, you can just use a GPS. So there's technology in this as well. There's also an expansion of NGO conservation governance, and it varies in its caliber. The other thing is the rise of producer and territorial associations that work with localities on regional management systems to reduce deforestation, but also to do things like reduce pollutants of various kinds, and also to kind of calm down the inherent violence of these many frontier areas. So one of the things that's happened is this rise of green governance, which is through rights and social movements within a sort of larger macroeconomic. Oh, I see people are shifting. I have to go through this more quickly. I know, I can just, it's like, will they never shut up? The answer is eventually. But one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that green governance and those rights and social movements produced this map. That is, this is a map that involves some pure environmental set-asides in the classic way of understanding them as the sort of non-interventionist things. But most of these are actually direct use, direct and indirect use, transitional categories, reservations. These are actually, so what this is a map of forested landscapes with people in them. So when we start to think about the social lives of forests, we're really looking at something like 60% of Amazonia is under some kind of land management in a forest context that involves inhabited forests. So this is really an extraordinary transformation in what has happened, and also as an ideological way of thinking about landscape from the wild, the ag, and the urban. What this says is that livelihoods can be forest-based, and that they can keep forests up, and that the diversity that everybody loves has a social context and social practice. So the deforestation, the ring of deforestation, of course, is right along here. I mean, it's not like nothing's going, and there's plenty of deforestation going through parts of Bolivia. So it's not like there's, everything has stopped. It's that within a different sort of set of economic and social transformations away from the authoritarian states, you've actually seen a transformation in land use. And as I say, it's reflected in this map. The other thing is that, of course, there's also the rise of green capitalism and from green hell to green markets. Maybe they're the same thing. I don't know. I wouldn't want to say. There's plenty of controversy about everything I'm saying, by the way. So this is not like somehow a happy story trotting off into a verdant sunset. But there certainly has been an explosion in social, organic, and certified markets. And they're mainly for tree crops. So what you see in many kinds of situations is that the value of these products has, and if you buy your coffee, you might have noticed the prices are going up right now. The other thing is, though, these international markets remain very important. There's also really important regional markets. Local timbers, acai has been eaten for millennia in Amazonia, so everybody loves it. There's fruits. So the successional management for even regional products is also extremely important. And the work of Robin Sears and Miguel Pinheiro on the whole dynamics of the entire city of Pucallpa being built from timber being managed by successional farmers, and of course the acai market, both national and international, being carried out by peasants in the estuary. The other thing that has helped a lot, actually, are things like commodity chain analysis that has started to look at where stuff is coming from and whether it's coming from deforestation, and then putting kinds of boycotts. So Amazonian boycotts of Amazonian beef and soy have become very important for Walmart, Carrefour. It's kind of easy in this sense because there's the international food world is so concentrated. There's about 3 people that you have to talk to and get it done. But that's for another time. But the other thing is that there's been this criminalization of taking Amazonian products from Amazonian deforestation areas, which are being monitored. So it's sort of Foucault in the forest in a hideous panopticon. But in any case, so there are like sort of deeper questions here. But if the forest is the only thing you care about, what's happened is that if you buy rainforest beef now, it can be an environmental crime. And then you get nailed for it. So the monitoring has been, and the commodity chain analysis and a kind of regional surveillance has been really activated in these areas. The other thing, of course, is the markets for environmental services. So that PES up there is payment for environmental services. The most well-known one that's being negotiated always is RED, reduced emissions from degradation and deforestation, in which we Californians pay people in Acre not to deforest, and other kinds of carbon offsets for the most part. So the point is that there are these sort of emergent markets, and they have a sort of externality payment built in, and also sanctions as well. So it's an interesting transformation, and this is certainly one thing that we can look at is really from the last decade. One thing that people don't think of so much when it comes to forests, except as a destructive element, is migration. Like those peasants will come in and they'll chop down the forest and then they'll wreck it. It was really nice and now it's ruined. Well, actually what my research is showing, and not just mine, but is that the dynamics of migration have a lot to say about the kinds of stories, the images that we just saw. First of all, we're in the age of movement. About 10% of the global population is migrating at any time. So we're now really about 700 million people are migrating around, either in urban areas or internationally. Internationally, it's about 200 million. So many countries have lots of people who don't live there, like El Salvador, Ecuador, 20% of their populations live in the United States. Nepal, the Philippines, you could just go down the list and you'd be amazed how many people do not live in their original cities. Also, if the amount of money that they are sending around is huge, about $400 billion. So anyway, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but really just to point out that one, there's a process of urbanization, but it's an urbanization that's kind of different from what we've seen before, since it's a lot more circular, it's much more back and forth in terms of its movement. The other thing is that it's changed the role of rural areas from being uniquely areas of rural production to being a sort of platform for constructing rather complex livelihoods. The other thing, so rural populations should be seen as semi-proletarianized, that is, they're in wage labor markets. They're also semi-urban, that is, they're going back and forth into cities, and people in cities are going back to rural areas. And often they're engaged in global processes and global products or global finance if they're receiving remittances. The other thing, of course, is that the dynamics of urbanization is one thing that underpins this. So the main thing I'm going to just sort of skip this. The one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that there are multi-sided households, that rural-urban subsistence strategies are sort of converging in a lot of ways. So that what we see now is major structural change within many economies. So this is a picture of Central America, and what you have is, you know, the dark brown there is traditional agro-exports. And you can see in 1978, most of the economy was around that. If you look into the 2006, and if it's even more pronounced now, what you see is an extraordinary proportion of remittances as being, as structuring the national incomes of the foreign exchange generation of these economies. So you're looking at really big structural change. Going from exporting coffee to exporting labor is a very big transformation in terms of how your economy is running. And also that is and that it's not spatially separated forever. So people go and migrate around and migrate back and forth. So it's important to keep this in mind too, that there's a larger scale structural, that it's not just commodities that we have to think about, it's also labor and finance as well. Well, one of the things to get to the point of finance is that we looked at what happens with remittances, because El Salvador is great because they have really good records. It's very tractable. It's small enough so that you don't, you know, start to cry, you know, when you look at your data. I don't know what's going on here. But here you can just sort of feel chuffed and powerful. So basically what you have is that the more, with households, if you look here, as households, and when you have more households getting remittances and the volume of remittances, you get a decline in forest clearing and an increase in forest resurgence. So not clearing, of course, gives you reduced deforestation, of course, but also when you're not clearing all the time, the secondary succession gets a chance to grow back. So one of the things that's important about this is that when you start to have cash transfers into rural areas, people are much less inclined to grow small-scale agricultural corn and beans and shift into something partly because of cheap food policies within these nations, and move into some other kinds of activities. The result of that is that actually you get a lot more forest. So I'm going to finish up here that first of all, we're in huge structural changes. And in the same way that deforestation reflected a huge structural shift, we're now in a different structural shift. And I think that these forests are a kind of an interesting barometer of social change or socioeconomic change at large scales, because they tell us that something is going on. Now, they don't exactly tell us everything about what's going on, but they tell us something, and they tell us about big structure. The second is that we're really seeing the impacts of globalizations. And forests are really always often very globalized sites. They have commodities that move around in international circuits very, very well. But also that we have to look at labor markets, we have to look at commodities, we have to look at information flow, we have to look at finance, we have to look at international institutions. So you can't, those global boycotts. We have to look at policy contexts and clandestine economies. And the question of urbanization. I won't go into the new sciences of the tropics. We'll be here all night. The other thing is that people really, looking at forest questions, don't look at migrations very much. And one of the reasons is that if people are migrating, they're not there. So they're hard to, as any migration scholar will tell you, they're kind of hard to find. So if you have a lot of ecologists, they will just sort of be looking at the stuff that's going on in the landscape, but the thing that's absent that may be actually shaping that landscape, which is migration, loss of labor, or the rise of remittances, or change in household economic strategy, gets lost in the story. And migrations are doing a lot of the shaping as we see today. So large-scale restructuring of environments in rural economies. So our old models don't help us understand any of this at all anymore. We are seeing an urban transition, intensification in a kind of agrarian transition, and all of these are feeding into the forest transition, which is the rise of increasing forest areas. I mentioned a little bit about the issues of nation building, and so it's important to realize that these are still very incipient, but that they are operating. Really, remember that the last peace accord was really only signed in 1996, so it's still kind of dicey. But one of the things that it has produced is the capacity for local populations to at least interact somewhat in the political processes, and also the rise and development of new institutions. The other thing is that we need to really go beyond the question of how we think about the rural. The rural is not anymore necessarily the agrarian, and that it may be that forest activities in which forests are managed and created are more important. And finally, urban and peri-urban sites are also important as production and sites of emerging forests as well, as many of our authors discuss as well. So it's important to realize that we're really seeing a dynamic change going on here. And again, if you throw your mind back to those reforesting landscapes and the larger reforesting of these landscapes more generally, I think we can very happily repeat the words of a Kayapo Indian named Payakan, who said, "A forest is one big thing. It has plants, it has animals, and it has people," which was something that, of course, was recognized by those great French painters. Okay, thanks a lot. There we go. What?
Okay, I think we have about 15 minutes for questions before the snacks are ready. What I'd like to ask people to do is to sort of make a line in the center aisle if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. We are recording tonight, so we'll have to ask you to speak into the microphone so that you can be heard on the recording. That's right. Or maybe the people are so hungry now that no one's going to ask a question. Let me ask a question. Right? If we take history seriously, which clearly this is a project about taking history seriously, about taking nature as a social space seriously, whether we think of that nature as the forest or we take the forest to be a metaphor for all kinds of forms of nature in which human beings shape, right, and also live in that thing they're shaping at the time that it's being shaped. It certainly has lots of implications for the kind of research that we're doing, and you pointed out a lot of those as well. But it also has lots of implications for policy. And Susanna, you've done a really nice job of talking about what some of those are. But do you ever wonder, do you ever worry, right? Is there an anxiety that the kind of research that takes history seriously, that takes human action seriously, could also present a danger to mobilizing conservation policy?
It depends. Well, of course, I'm going to do that evasive thing. It depends, but it sort of does depend. One of the problems that has occurred is that you have a lack of attention. We don't really know all the dynamics that are producing these forests all over the place. They're quite specific, and the environmental narratives tend to be sort of, and then there was population growth, and then, you know, we killed everything. So the problem that I sort of see about history is that history is a lot more contingent. And forests are presented in such a monolithic way that, and that the kinds of dynamics that work to produce forests can't really be kind of a generalized thing. So what I would argue is that creating kind of social spaces or institutional spaces in which things can unfold, you're more likely to get a better outcome than that. But I think we're still kind of early. What we have in terms of conservation stuff is so phenomenally generalized in the form of the set-aside that most people working in conservation are completely unaware of the fact that forests are coming back, and they're in this panicky mode of setting aside as much as possible rather than thinking about, if you will, the acupressure points where you can improve or further engage the processes of forest recovery. So one of the things, just to go back from the stuff in southern Brazil, they're all frantically trying, even though that area is getting more and more forest, it's also, some of that forest is clonal eucalyptus, which can be harvested in a 6-year cycle. But they're sort of worrying about setting aside more land into that park rather than thinking about the larger landscape, because you can never get, you cannot turn the entire world into a park. So rather than thinking about the forms of intervention in which you could be producing a kind of eucalyptus or substituting eucalyptus with other kinds of fast-growing local trees, as is being done in Peru, they're just, you know, they don't, the conservation strategy is not for what I'm calling acupressure points, where you can kind of improve and enhance the service, the biodiversity, livelihood, and economic value of these forests. It's only a kind of monolithic strategy, which is the set-aside.
Do you want to weigh in?
Let's go ahead and take
Okay, let's go ahead and take the next question, please.
Hi. I read the article in the Alumni Magazine way back and just thought it was just really fascinating, this work. I do work with urban wood in the U.S. and encouraging the use of. And so I'm just curious your take on the USGBC lead buildings requiring FSC wood. I mean, just to try and bring it back to the U.S. here and how the implications.
Do you want to?
No, you.
Okay.
I mean, I'm sure you have opinions on this.
Yeah, I have a student who's doing a lot of work on certification, and the problem that you have with certification is that it is bureaucratically extremely complicated, and the second thing is that people lie about it all the time, even if it's the Forest Stewardship Council is FSC for those who aren't familiar with the acronym. It takes away a lot of management autonomy. So there's a lot of resistance. There's quite a big debate about participating in those markets. The other thing is, I mean, it's not clear that it has any control over the markets for fine woods, which are all clandestine. So there are situations where you could imagine sort of certification of an ejido and so on, where you could get better control over it at a kind of community level. But there's this huge clandestine market where 80% of Brazilian woods that go into the international market are in fact even whether they have the FSC thing on it, are not really certified. They're illegal. So it's not exactly clear to me. When people say, which wood should I buy from the tropics, I say, buy American. Don't bother with it, because anything you think you're buying is something else.
Thank you. It was a wonderful presentation, both of them, and it sounds like a very exciting book. I had a question just from the very beginning of the book, from the first page, first sentence, first clause. You say, in the popular consciousness. And then pretty quickly you start talking about historical narratives, scientific literature, and such. And so I guess my question is kind of in the spirit of the global environment. Is there something in the book, or is there a sense in which we need to think about how in the popular consciousness might be a variegated arena for the kind of presentation that you're giving? Perhaps it would be more appropriate to say in the professional consciousness, or I guess the question I'd really be interested to know is, from your experience, is the popular consciousness, as we can configure that, perhaps different in different parts of the world? If we are to take the whole world in the frame, are there parts of the world where exactly what you're describing is happening, but people don't necessarily accept the narrative that you guys have kind of undercut? And I guess what does that mean if we have to kind of take multiple levels of where the story is? I recognize for the American, European environmental movement, this is a serious intervention that they'll have to grapple with. But what about for all the people that we're talking about in terms of their social lives of the forest? What is their consciousness of what you're describing? Thank you.
The world is a big place, right? I mean, and there's a lot of variability. So, I mean, it's certainly true, right? And it's a sweeping statement in the popular consciousness, because there is no single popular consciousness, as you point out, right? But one factor, besides NGOs, environmental groups, and so on, one important player here, of course, is the state, right? And so I think that, speaking from someone, not on the Latin American side of things, that notion of necessary degradation, the threat posed, to forests by local people, or sort of anyone else other than the state, basically, is very much the case across large parts of Asia, right? Where you have a significant government control over forest policy, access to forest land, and so on. So a huge portion of the landmass of the contemporary nation-state of India is actually under the control of the Forest Department, which is something that should not be at all unfamiliar to us here in North America, where, in the United States, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, so the proportion of public lands in the U.S. is actually quite significantly high, right? So it may be that the consciousness of the sort of the popular imagination that we're talking about are indeed the people who set government policies, who write articles, who organize NGOs, and so on, and not, for example, someone who's a soliga collector in the BR Hills, right? I suspect that they're not so much worried about the sort of satellite image of their landscape as with more immediate livelihood issues. But I mean, it makes me just think of a bit of an answer to Mark's question too, that's related to what you say about is a discussion of that pointing out that, say, things aren't as horrible as we thought, or that human beings are not innately and necessarily destructive of nature and natural landscapes, does that imperil conservationist goals? What I would say, and again, from a part of the world where generally conservationist goals are often very heavy-handed and centrally imposed, it's clear that those conservationist goals are very detrimental to the lives and livelihoods of the most poor, of the most disenfranchised of society in South Asia. That's certainly the case, right? So that conservation is very much an activity for, affluent, middle and upper class, urban people who want there to be tigers when they go on vacation so that they can see them. That the people who actually live with tigers, on the other hand, are being pushed out of the equation, right? So what I would say is, and I'm in favor of tigers in a big way. I mean, I really, really like tigers, okay? But there has to be a new definition of conservation, one which is more equitable. And I'm happy to say that at least, in the part of the world I know best, there we have the work of social scientists, of natural scientists, ecologists, are working very much with, everyone has their own NGO in India. 2 Indians, 3 NGOs, they say, is that they're working very much with thinking of how can we manage human-wildlife conflict? How can we achieve the kind of ecological goals that we have for protecting, say, this particular type of bird or whatever it is, and also human beings? So that there's a concerted effort, I think, on the part of scholars and activists, and it's slowly coming around to the government side to think about that. But I think there's no question that this is definitely the dominant discourse.
Let me just also intercede here a little bit, too, thinking about Latin America a little more clearly than when Mark first posed the question, which is, of course, that map which had all those little land uses on it of inhabited environments. That was articulated in the 1988 Constitutional Convention in Brazil with the end of the dictatorship. And essentially, it created the kind of institutional and legal structure that permitted inhabited environments to have conservation standing. So and if you think about some of the politics of ejidos and so on, essentially what they argue is that they are conservation units as much as they are social units, and that after all, I think if you look at Mexican forests, something like 80% of them are actually under the stewardship of indigenous or local populations. So in essence, you do have a kind of counter narrative that comes from a different kind of conservation that's linked to actually managing these systems over periods of time. But they get really disrupted by migration, both into these areas and out of them, because it takes time to manage it.
And it's so far from perfect, but I mean, there are moves for things like what's usually called joint forest management, which again is a similar kind of thing in which more decision-making power and sovereignty is accorded to local populations and less to the state.
Next question, please.
Yes. Hi. How strong is the activism in these areas, and the government? Is there any involvement from legislators in these areas? Is there any strong pushback or resistance? Can you talk about that? Or would you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a couple of things. One is that you have 3 big Amazon states, Amapá, Amazonas, and Acre, that have decided, which are also areas of a great deal of activism, which have decided to take a forest path of development. So they're not really going to be agrarian areas. The other thing is that you have had a lot of, that region has a long history of insurgents. So there's a lot of resistance. So you might have heard about the big Belo Monte Dam that's being widely resisted and so on. So there's a lot of environmental activism, but it's very closely linked to, if you will, forest people's movements and livelihood movements. So it's quite widespread, and that would be also true in Mexico.
And in the slides that I showed, so what are usually referred to as tribal peoples in South Asia, who are seen as these kind of ancient remnants, they and many others also have been, very active in politically. And the picture that I flew up at the end was, a protest actually against a land grab. So the people, people are definitely active, aware, and fighting back.
Well, this will be our final question.
Hi, I'm an Eagle Scout, and I'm involved in the Outdoor Adventure Club here on campus. So most of my activity with the outdoors and the nature has been kind of like a recreational sense, but also there's still the idea of like setting aside these like sacred parts of our country. And I was wondering if you thought that the framework of like the national parks we have here in America as these sort of separate places where primarily for recreation and like kind of just experiencing the outdoors is a helpful framework, or should policy with the national parks and forest preserves be moving in a different direction?
Yeah, the U.S., I mean, is an interesting case because, of course, it's really here in the U.S. that the notion of wilderness really, you know, has its grip most firmly. And I think a lot of the kind of models of conservation that involve set-asides and the idea of, you know, places without humans have their antecedents in American experience, for sure, right? But, I mean, there's a history here as well, of course, right? So the classic example really is Yellowstone National Park, right? Yellowstone National Park was at one point an occupied landscape, right? There were plenty of Native American peoples living in what is now, well, not so much a human-free zone because Yellowstone is full of all kinds of tourists, right? But in the process of creating these set-asides, it's a kind of government enclosure, right? In a sense in which people are historically have been excluded, right? On the other hand, you know, it's happened. I mean, it's history, it's been done, you know, and so there's not necessarily, the fact that that happened doesn't necessarily mean that the US government should suddenly allow people to settle in the middle of Yellowstone either, right? I mean, it's not always the case that you can't turn back the clock, in fact, right? So I think that the kind of, you know, broader understanding of human, not just forest, coexistence, you know, is extremely important. But one thing that's also come out in the book, I'll say, just trying to be good to our authors, is the idea of the importance of what Perfecto and Vanderveer refer to as the matrix, right? That is the agrarian, agricultural, sort of the non-forest landscape around forests. So it's not that it's not important to have any set-asides, or there shouldn't be any national parks, or, you know, or wildlife reserves. That's not the point at all, right? But the point is that the larger landscape also is, as they point out, and they're ecologists, point out, is extremely important for protecting different species and understanding, I'm sorry, I'm getting tired, understanding and stopping processes of extinction and so on, right? So we have to pay attention also to the quality of the matrix surrounding national parks and set aside. So it's not that it's bad to have national parks or forests, but in some cases it has been bad for particular people. And what's ancient history to us, in the case of someplace like Yellowstone, is an ongoing history in parts of Africa, in parts of Asia right now, where it's a people who are forest dependent and who have, in effect, you might argue, as we had in the case of our Nilgiri Hill example, these were the people who made the forests, right? And now we're saying you have to get out because you're a threat to the forest? That just doesn't make any sense, right? So we have to understand those processes well so that, you know, we can make these policies in a sensible kind of way.
I think there's another point that maybe we should bring up too, which is with all these carbon offsets, particularly in the humid tropics, what's happening is that you're having sort of an economic offset, which is that basically these areas are kind of excluded. In order to get investors to invest, they have to know that actually a certain percentage of carbon is going to be sucked out by such and such area. And so one of the things that's happening is you're seeing quite a few what are called environmental enclosures, where basically they're monitored by ecology. This is going on in Peru a lot. So there's sort of areas that are monitored by ecologists for their carbon absorbing thing, and of course animals are running around, but it criminalizes previous use of these areas by local populations and often directly excludes them. I mean, they get fenced or they have guards. So there's another dynamic that this is now being sort of phrased not in terms of local biodiversity, but in terms of planetary security. And it actually is an expulsion movement when actually these forests have been managed and often produced by these populations. So there's a lot of controversy, and the thing is, the world's a big place, these forests are complicated, and the processes really vary from place to place. So it's not like, you know, the thing that everybody loves about Malthusian is the Malthusian model is it's like population goes up, resources go down, you're done, you know? And with this, it's, you know, populations go up, forests go up, they get more productive, they get less, you know, it's a more complicated story and much more contingent.
But I think recreation is, you know, still, I think it's very important for, you know, urban dwellers and for sort of developing a sense of affect and a sense of connection, right, with places that are not urban places, right? As a parent, I definitely take my child, you know, to nature reserves and wildlife reserves, and I enjoy doing that myself, right? So, I mean, I mocked a little bit the, you know, middle and upper class Indian environmentalists who want to protect tigers, but the love of tigers also leads to all kinds of other benefits for, you know, natural areas, for things which are a little bit less cuddly, although, you know, tigers, I wouldn't cuddle with them. But I mean, so for snakes and lizards, you know, all plants, all those other kinds of things. So there's definitely a role to be played, right, for things like recreation and, you know, enjoyment of natural areas by people like you and me.
Okay, with that, I'd like to thank Kathy and Susanna for making the forest such a complicated and interesting place, and invite everyone to continue the conversation over the reception in the next room.